Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Daniela Rodrigues. She's an invited assistant professor at Universidade Católica Portuguesa, where she teaches master's students about the cognitive foundations of language. She studies gestural communication in human and non-human primates, and today we're going to talk about exactly that: communication in non-human apes, gestures, child-directed communication, language, and some other related topics. So, Daniela, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you for the invitation, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Yeah.
So let me start by asking you, which kind of non-human apes have you studied the most, just to have a little bit of background here.
So actually, I was lucky enough to study lots of different primates. It was mostly behavior studies, but I studied some lemurs, also some crab-eating macaques, mandrills, and then also chimpanzees. And I focus mostly on chimpanzees during my PhD, and even a bit before my PhD, I already started like collecting data in chimpanzees. Yes, and humans.
And what kinds of?
Sorry.
Yeah, sure. No worries. What kinds of communication do you study in non-human apes?
So most of my work is in gestures. So usually researchers in primate communication study vocalizations, facial expressions or gestures, and early work was just focus on each modality. Last decades, I would say that people tend to study these different modalities together a bit, at least having these multimodality into account. So most of my work is in gestures, but we have I've been collecting also data in vocalizations and facial expressions. So my first studies have all these modalities into account, and then I specialized in gestural research.
So what kind of gestures do you study in non-human apes?
So mostly it's a bit different from human research because we study like all body gestures, and we also use a different methodology, different names. I would say it's an approach that is more descriptive. So it's basically we have lots of things in common, but the way we address gestures in human research and non-human research, it's a bit different. So what I try to do, and because I study also humans, gestures in humans, I use the same approach, and I use this descriptive approach that is more common in non-human primates, and I use these same names, this same approach to study both. So, for example, it's only a subset of the gestures that we have in humans. I'm aware that human research in the gestural domain, we have lots of different things. But for example, in non-human primates, we tend to be more cautious in interpreting, for example, gestures or to consider it a gesture in the first place. So we study a subset of these gestures. For example, the ones that are communicative, the intentional gestures, the ones that involve a change in the behavior of the recipient. So, of course, we know that we cover only a small part of the gestural world, but I would say that most of the research in non-human primates, it's this subset of gestures.
So I know that you've studied greetings and leave-takings. What are they?
So greetings and leave-takings are basically the little rituals that we do when we say hello, like say hello and goodbye to people when we meet or when we are about to leave. So I studied those kind of rituals, the signals that are exchanged during arrivals and departures in one community of chimpanzees. So we had like a really great setting where you have like this outdoor laboratory where they would go there to crack some nuts, and they would join others that were already there, for example, and they will leave also at different times. So it was a perfect setting to check if they greet each other or if they say goodbye. And yeah, basically it's hard to tell if they actually are, if I arrive up to a place and say hello, or if I just saying how the weather is like outside, like in other place. It's hard to tell what is a greeting or not. So of course, we, at least in our study, what we did is considering all the signals that are changed during arrivals or during departures. But of course, this doesn't mean that are greetings or leave takings, so then we have like some challenges, and probably we'll talk about these a bit later. But yeah, it's basically these kind of signals that we change when we meet someone or when we are about to leave.
But how do you go about studying these kinds of gestures? I mean, how do you know that when they do a particular kind of gesture, they're doing a greeting or a leave taking?
Yeah, so this is the first challenge. So we have actually considered, and we have lots of variability in definitions if you check in the literature. And this is quite challenging because then if you want to know if this species it's like some greetings reported in this community, for example, the way people define a greeting is quite different from, for example, other research group, and sometimes it's a bit hard then to compare results in different communities, even in the same species, if the research is conducted by different people. So this is the first challenge, like about the definition. So some people consider a greeting even if, for example, chimpanzees or other animals, if they are already present, but they approach other individual a bit closer, and they could greet each other. So like the signals, it is changed during that interaction. But other ones will involve like they would need to have like a separation, a physical separation in the physical space, I would say. So for more, for example, than 5 minutes, others like it's more than 1 hour absent. So of course, these will also will imply different interpretations and results. Leave takings, it's another story because it's not very studied. But even the challenges are similar, I would say, because greetings are a bit more studied and involve what are the types of signals that we already know a bit about the functions and how they are so important in maintaining and keeping relationships. It's somehow easier, but we face similar problems because sometimes we tend to overinterpret some of the things. And for example, the leave takings, we are not sure sometimes if we are very cautious about the signals and choosing the signals that are changed that we can consider a gesture, for example, or not. And I would say that we cannot be super sure about the nature of the gestures. First of all, because it's declarative in nature. So if I say goodbye, I don't expect also that the others will change the behavior. And basically the communication that the gestural communication studies usually, as I mentioned before, focus on this subset of communication that imply changes in the behavior of the recipient. They imply intentional criteria, so lots of different things that sometimes it's hard to tell in a leave taking if these are occurring or not, right?
Mm-hmm. And in chimpanzee fusion societies which you've studied, how do these gestures work? And by the way, what is a fusion society?
So fusion societies are societies like when individuals basically come and go pretty often, so they don't spend all the time together. And this is actually super important because, of course, to understand a bit the role of greetings and leave takings, because if in one community you spend all the time together, maybe greetings and lift takings are not so important, right? But in your society, like in your community, if you come and go pretty often, if sometimes you can spend like few hours or days without seeing the other individuals. Of course, things happen outside, like, and you'll probably meet other individuals, and it's super important. If greetings are so important to maintain and to check social relationships among each other, it's in these moments they invest a lot, not only to greet and to be able to check if they were standing in the same place as they seen before the other individuals, also to inform the other ones present. So they have a very important role in these societies when they don't, they are not together all the time.
Yeah. And so I read in your work that there are some contextual and social factors that play a role in who, when, and how chimpanzees greet. Tell us about that.
So one important thing to start with is that they don't greet all the time. Like even if they arrive to a place, and we probably would assume that they will at least say hello to anyone present. And actually, in our study, we've seen that in a bit more than a half of the cases, they didn't greet anyone. So it happens sometimes they just arrive and they start making nuts and do other behaviors. So this is also important, just to have this in mind. But then, of course, if they arrive to a place and there is like a group of chimpanzees, they don't greet everyone present. So they are super selective in the ones that are greeting. Usually, it's high-ranking individuals or males or a specific individual for some reason, because of course there is all this context about what happened before, or the mood of the group, if they are aroused or not. So of course there is like all these things that they have into account, and sometimes for us as a researcher is very difficult to have. Of course we collect data on most of the things that we can collect, but sometimes it's impossible. We are not following them 24 hours, and it's hard to complete the puzzle of this social complexity they have. But yeah, I think at least knowing, we know that this social complexity of like their lives plays a super important role, and we do our best, but it's hard like to tell. I would say, I don't know if we are going into this a bit later, but so for example, as I said before, so the ones they choose to greet, it's one of the important things, and sometimes they choose not to greet at all different individuals. But so these social roles they have in the group, so for example, hierarchy plays an important role, so the kinship, so they also will, depending on the relationship they have with each individual, they may choose, for example, okay, this is a friend or a kin individual, like I have like a more predictable outcome if I would communicate with my friend, so maybe I will invest a bit more in greeting like one male that I'm not so confident if he's okay with me approaching, so I would say that these contextual factors that I mentioned before, like arousal, what happened before, for how long they don't see each other, but also these social relationship between them. And also another important thing, it's like the audience, like the ones present or not. Sometimes they get more confident, for example, if they could have like some friends, some allies nearby, of course, or they may feel a bit insecure if there is like males or high-ranking individuals there, and maybe they would prefer not to greet anyone present, or
Yeah. So you mentioned social rank there. I have here somewhat of a list of other factors which I read about in your work. How about kinship? I mean, do chimpanzees tend to greet other chimpanzees who are genetically related to them?
So usually what we've seen, at least in this study, is that they are not investing much in breeding. If they are their kids, like if there's like someone related to them, they usually prefer to invest the greetings in other non-related individuals. So it was quite, and it's why we think that maybe about this uncertainty of the outcome. So chimpanzees sometimes get pretty aggressive, and I've seen in some videos that I analyzed that. So, for example, if someone would greet a male that is not very high ranking and the alpha male is nearby, he would beat like someone just because, okay, you greet this male first, you know, so they are a bit so aggressive sometimes, depending on the situations. But so, for example, if they have a more close relationship, even if it's not kin, I only focused or only coded these relationships if they were kin or not related. But also we see this in more close individuals. So if they are friends, if they spend more time together, they are kind of more tolerant to each other, and it's not super important to signal that my friendly intent of coming by, you know. So we didn't see in terms of frequency of greetings much greetings in kin-related individuals.
How about their position as a traveler or party member? Does that influence the way they greet?
We also didn't find evidence for that. So, for example, I don't know, in some cultures also these in humans these vary. So maybe, of course, in chimpanzees, and it's one thing that I want to mention. So this was only in one community. In Western African chimpanzees. So we also need to be aware that this can vary a lot in different communities. But at least in this study, we didn't find evidence. So if it was the one that was already in the party, like in the group, or the one that was joining the group that was greeting or not. So we didn't find any evidence. And for example, in some cultures, maybe in human cultures, it's more common the one that is arriving, for example, that is the one that is greeting. But here, we didn't find. And the same, for example, so we focused on not only the communication of this individual when arriving, but we studied to be able to address the selective nature of their greetings. We studied all the possible interactions between that individual and the other ones present. If they were traveling together, even or separated by 5 minutes or 10 minutes or wherever, we were studying the behavior, like the possible communication occurring during these individuals with everyone, to be able to say, okay, they were preferring to communicate with this individual. And also, for example, if they were traveling together or separated by a short amount of time, they would not greet those chimpanzees. So it was this travel or party member position, and also this possibility of being traveling together that didn't have an impact.
Mm-hmm. I also read about the level of potential threat, but first of all, what constitutes a potential threat in these kinds of societies, and then how does it influence greeting?
So mostly we address this by different contexts. And the level of arousal we considered. So when they were super aroused, if there was like a fight before, like usually agonistic context and sexual context, they also get pretty aroused. And it's where we only divided in 3 general levels. So high arousal, neutral, and low arousal. And these constitute, so that the high arousal would constitute mostly agonistic and sexual context, for example. Neutral would be feeding, resting, like the things that most often don't involve much social interactions, but although they are all engaging in the same place doing the same things. And low arousal would be some affiliative context, for example, play. They were pretty more relaxed, I would say. And so, and how these impact greetings. we've seen that these neutral contexts, and we would expect for that, they usually don't, in the terms of frequency, they don't involve much greetings. Like we've seen that in the exchange of signals. So in high arousal contexts, they would change more often signals, and also when they are pretty relaxed, it's also like a safe place sometimes to change more signals. So it's like either high arousal or low arousal, and then the way they greet will vary. So of course, if they are super nervous, for example, what we see more, they will use lots of vocalizations. And when they are a bit more relaxed, they would use more gestures, for example. But in greetings in general, I would say, and one of the most known signals exchange, and here in our study too, is the pangrants. This vocalization that is also high connected to the dominance and the ranks of the individuals. Usually it's the lower ranking individuals that vocalize towards high ranking. And this was one of the most, the signals most present in our study.
This is something that you mentioned briefly earlier, but how about the presence of mature males? How do they influence greetings?
So it's the same in our study. It was the same trend that there was like also reported in pangrant studies, like also greeting studies, but with this vocalization I mentioned before. And there was like this inhibitory effect. So when there were like other mature males present or high-ranking individuals, they tended to greet less. So yeah, at least, so we always measure this possibility to greet, one of the opportunity to greet each individual. So in terms of this big pool, we found that there's inhibitory effect that was already reported to pangrants. But here in our study, because we included all vocalizations, also facial expressions and gestures, we found that's the same trend.
Yeah. So that's about chimpanzees. What about humans? What do we know about the greetings and leave-takings in human societies?
So there is a lot of variation in culture. So I would say it's universal because you can see it like across the globe. But the way people greet each other or they say goodbye to each other, it varies a lot. So for example, even the same thing that I mentioned before, if I arrive to a place, maybe I may choose to greet just one person or everyone. Maybe I don't, in some cultures, they don't, and I think I will see this later, they don't address children, for example, or they can just greet the chief of the tribe, or
Yeah.
so there are also differences in the people you choose to greet when you arrive at a place or to say goodbye, but also in terms of the signals you change. So we also have this flexibility in the same culture to use different signals depending on who you greet. So for example, of course, if I would greet maybe a university professor, might be a bit more formal or different. If I greet a friend, of course, and even if I greet a friend like that I see yesterday, it's different from if I see this same friend like if I didn't see him like in 3 years or 4. So we have this ability to adjust our greetings. In the same cultures, we do it differently. If we compare cultures, we have even different signals, different choices in who we greet. So I would say lots of different variations of greetings. And the way we say goodbye, I would say it works the same, in the same way. I think both have a super important function of also maintaining, as I mentioned before, for the chimpanzees, maybe, of course, not in the same extent, but they also inform people about social relationships. So people around, if I hug someone and give a handshake to another one, they will notice that my relationship will be different, right? So I think there is like some similarities in terms of they are super important to keep social relationships and to inform uh, if there are like also changes in the way we are fusion societies as well. So you don't spend all the time together. Some things may have happened in your absence. So I think these moments are also super important, as I mentioned before, for the chimpanzees.
So it's then the case that greetings and leave takings, their presence is a human universal. I mean, they occur across all human societies, or at least the ones that we've studied. And then, I mean, who we greet, when we greet, and all of those other contextual factors, they vary cross-culturally, and they are, I would imagine, very heavily influenced by culture. Correct?
Yeah, no. So basically, yeah, it's that like we've seen some of these the things that you mentioned. So people would choose how you greet, and if you compare across cultures, one of the things that you see, like greeting and leave takings, are quite universal because they occur, but the way they occur, the people who greet or the people who decide to communicate is quite different. So we can infer that this is a universal behavior, and it's why it seems super interesting to study the evolutionary origins of these behaviors. And it's when you study other close phylogenetic relatives, so the other great apes, or even in other animals, it's also pretty studied. And these functions of keeping and maintaining social relationships plays an important role. So yeah, I think the most interesting part of these is being able to go back and say, okay, the way we, so for example, there's like some signals like embrace and kiss that we also see in chimpanzees, or bow. So there is, when you study these gestures, for example, or some of the vocalizations, of course it's a bit more different, but for gestures in specific that I'm more focused on, it is quite nice to see that there is like some of these signals that we also see in humans. So what we can also some infer when we compare humans and other great apes, if you see similar behaviors, you can infer that probably our last common ancestor had similar communicative registers or behaviors. So it's how you can go back and date some of the things in terms of evolutionary origins. Of course, this is always you cannot be sure, but it's how we usually work. And if you see in more distant related species, you can consider convergent evolution, for example. But yeah, I guess the most interesting thing. So the most interesting thing here is going back to study the evolution of these rituals, the greetings and leave takings, and be able to infer probably our last common ancestor also did these behaviors. So for greetings, they are quite spread around the animal kingdom. So maybe it's super interesting just to study more detailed more details about the signals. So for example, as I mentioned, the types of signals. Were they present maybe, instead of general questions.
Mm-hmm. So I also read in your work that individuals, both in non-human apes and in humans, learn to adjust their communication during their development. I mean, why do they do that? Why? What is the social importance of that?
So if you think about primates in general, we have like a long period of in which we are dependent on our mothers and caregivers. So it's a safe place to learn, right? So there is no this social pressure, or we are safe because our mothers would protect us. So I would say humans in general, of course, but I was thinking more about chimpanzees now. But you have like a long period in which you are able to learn from your environment, from the social relationships, and to pick how the social rules, and the same works for the communication. So to be able to survive and navigate this complex world, the social complex world that I mentioned before, you need to know how these things work. And when you are super young, because you are protected by your mother, you can just learn from the environment, right? And the communication is the same thing. Of course, they will learn by the surrounding environment, and we can talk about this a bit later. But also the way mothers and other individuals address their infants or immature individuals could be also a bit different. But all these adaptations, I would say that they are super important to survive. So if an individual is able to adjust their communication depending on the situation, so for example, if a chimp will exaggerate their signals to attract the attention of a female, they will probably be more successful in this sexual context, for example. Or if there is like some aggression going on, maybe if I'm able to adjust the communication and to have a more silent register, or maybe I can survive a bit more. So this is very the ability to adjust the communication to different contexts, to different individuals. I would say that it's super important to survive in the group and to be accepted by the group, and to navigate these hierarchies, to have some allies that are super important. And during the development is the way that you can learn how things work. Then the way you learn, of course, for example, in humans, we have this active learning or active teaching. In chimpanzees is a bit different, but here I would say it's more it's what we will talk now about, this kind of child or immature communication, directed communication. So the way infant learns or immature individuals learn these things might differ a bit between if you compare humans and other apes.
Mm-hmm. So let's get then into child-directed communication. What is it, and which species have you studied it in?
So I studied in chimpanzees, like again, so my PhD was focused on our ability to adjust our language, our communication. And so I did these studies in greetings and leave takings, but also then I focused on child-directed communication. And here I studied in how this ability emerged in our ontogeny in humans, and also so in chimpanzees in general, if this communicative register is present or not in chimpanzees. And for that, so I collect data on toddlers, so in humans, in different groups of toddlers. And in chimpanzees, I studied two groups, two different communities.
And what forms of child-directed communication can we find then in chimpanzees?
So I focused again on, these studies were mainly focused on gestures. I guess I said it before, but so why this interest in gestures in particular? Because although we see lots of vocalizations and facial expressions, and of course we have all these into account, even if we study gestures, we collect some general information about these other modalities. But in terms of the evolutionary origins of language and communication, there is this special interest in studying gestures because they look more flexible than vocalizations and facial expressions. I'm not saying that they are not flexible. The other modalities, they are, and studies that are coming, and with new technology, we see that they actually are pretty flexible. But compared to the complexity we see in human speech, the researchers were looking for some of these features, and they failed. Like when analyzing vocalizations, for example, and facial expressions, they would say they were more tied to emotional states. So we see more flexibility in gestures, and it was in gestures that I focused my research for the child-directed communication. Like in toddlers, it's super important, this developmental stage where before they learn how to speak properly, they rely a lot on gestures. So I was focusing on gestures, the gestures they use, and look at if they were adjusting when they were communicating with younger toddlers, for example. And for the chimpanzees, I was more interested also in gestures, focusing on gestures, but more generally speaking, if they were adjusting also their gestures, but finer features of gestures, because we already know that there are some infant-directed gestures in other great apes, like in gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees. They exist, and there's like some general features. So, for example, in gorillas, the mothers will use more repetitive sequences with tactile elements, for example, or in chimpanzees, we know that this tactile modality is more present when they are young, and they use visual gestures and silent gestures when they grow older. So we already know that exists some kind of infant-directed communication, but not in the same way. So never was in the literature, we didn't find any evidence for these finer grained features of child-directed communication that we studied in humans. So, for example, what is child-directed communication is like this register that we use when we talk with babies and infants. So we change our pitch, the frequency, the rhythm, like the temporal patterns. So we tend to communicate slower with more pauses, using a different pitch, as I mentioned before, repeating more. And it's like this kind of detail that it's not studied so often in other great apes. So in our study, we focused more on these like temporal patterns, the repetitions as well. We looked the complexity of the vocabulary, like as we tend to use simple vocabulary when we address children. We also look at these in both. So I used similar methodologies for the toddlers and for the chimpanzees, but not to compare one thing. So in one study, I was focusing on the emergence of these register of motherese in humans, to see if they were already present in our gesture modality before being able to speak properly. And in the other study was to see if there were at all present these features, these finer grained features in chimpanzees.
Right. And so, in terms of the gestures that are directed at children, in the case of chimpanzees, what characterizes them and how do they differ from the ones that are directed at adults?
So in chimpanzees, you mentioned, right?
Yes.
So I would say that the first part of our study was actually compare like how females, so we focus on females, would communicate with other adults compared to infants. So, for example, to see if there was a different register. And we found some differences. Specifically, I think it was a bit surprising because it was not the same thing that we've seen in humans. So mostly they were in humans. What we see, they simplify the vocabulary, they use a slower rhythm, and in our case, in chimpanzees, they were using shorter gestures. So, for example, when communicating with younger individuals. And this is a bit counterintuitive because actually, if they would have like the same function like the child-directed communication to facilitate communicative functions, you would expect they would use slower rhythm, like a slower pace. They would the gesture duration would be longer as well, but it's not what we've seen. So at least the shorter gestures were one of our findings, and it was quite surprising. Yeah.
So when it comes to mother-offspring pairs, do mothers adjust their communication based on their offspring developmental stage and their sex?
So yes and no for some of the things. So for the age, we've seen some results, yes, and I'll go to that. I'll go back to that later. But for example, one of the things that we've seen that there was like no effect of the sex of the offspring. So why, in the first place, we also were interesting to know if they would adjust. First of all, because it's already reported that the mothers will adjust their sociality, so they will adjust their behavior according to the sex of the offspring. So we were thinking maybe they also adjust their communication. And also we know that young immature males, for example, in chimpanzees, they will have in terms of gestural repertoire, it's reported that it's larger than the females. But so we were thinking like maybe here there is like some communicative adaptation as well, but we didn't find anything regarding the sex. So we think that maybe they already adjust their behavior, and that's a bit enough. So probably they create more opportunity. So if they have a infant male as so first of all, sorry, because sometimes I assume that you already know this, but males will stay in the same community. Most of the males will stay in the same community when they grow up and stay in the hierarchy of that group, but females tend to migrate. So this is also an important thing to consider. Why would they expect differences in the sex of the individuals? And mothers with male offspring, they would, or what was reported is that they hang out like more with the group of the chimpanzees, the community. They make more effort to be socially involved in other activities compared to when they have female offspring. But in terms of gestures, we didn't see any difference. So we think that maybe they have even the differences in the gestural, the size of the repertoire might have to do with these more opportunities that young males have to socialize, because mothers will make this extra effort to be around more individuals. But so for the sex, we didn't find anything. And for the age, as I mentioned before, so we had like this effect. So first, when we analyzed females to communication to adults and other to adults and to young individuals, we saw that trend. But when we analyzed the subset of mother offspring, we also found repetition. That is also a common feature studied in motherese. But also again, the opposite trend. They were repeating more often to older offspring. So usually when we are talking to young kids, we tend to repeat a lot, because this helps, right? Facilitates language acquisition. So we are also expecting that maybe they would repeat a bit more when addressing immatures, like younger immatures, but we didn't find that trend.
Right. And is motherese, or this kind of child-directed communication that we humans have, is it a human universal?
So yes, it's a bit similar to what you asked me about the greetings. So you see across the globe, so you would say this is universal. In weird, like the Western, like the weird cultures, right? Like the Western compared to non-Western cultures. So you see a lot of differences, but in general, when they address kids, they change the way they communicate. So what we can infer, it's present in most of the cultures. At least it's reported in most of the cultures. So we can infer that it's universal. But then the frequency of, for example, of the communication that we direct to a child, it also varies a lot in the cultures. And the things in our way we communicate that we adjust, it's also quite different. So in some cultures, for example, they don't address so often the kids directly. So of course, this also varies, and they still learn. So we know that motherese is super important to language acquisition, but the fact that in these cultures, they don't address kids directly often, and still they acquire the language. So they can, and it's here where the surrounding environment is super important. So they probably are picking up the communication in the environment also to learn and to make these models of language.
Right. So for the last part of our conversation today, I have here just a few more general questions to ask you. So when it comes to establishing a connection between chimpanzees and humans in terms of communication, would there be a connection through gestures and also between gestures and language?
Um, yeah, so in my work, what I was focusing on was precisely that, like the connection that we can establish between, so like the evolution of our language, and specifically the evolution of our communicative systems. Because of course the way you define like language, human language, is super complex. So it helps us if we try to establish the origin of language. It's useful to try to take apart all these different components of language, like uh, to try to put it in simple terms and simple components that we then can look at those things in other primates. And also, most important, so using similar definitions, similar methodologies. Of course, this implies always to have some adaptations, because it's not possible. And here is where the challenge is, because sometimes the nature of communication is so different that we need to do an adaptation here and there. But keeping like comparable is super important, because what we've seen before is like some researchers, mostly that are focused on human research, do like use a methodology that is not possible to apply in other primates, and vice versa. And then other people, or even these same researchers, will compare to the other findings, but we are not comparing similar things, so it's hard to also be fair in these comparisons. So what we try to do, it's like using gestures, so focusing here on gestures because of the reasons that I mentioned before, the fact that they are used in a flexible and intentional way, so they are promising modality to study the evolution of our language. And because we also we also use a lot of gestures in development, in even as I'm speaking, I'm using gestures, right? So we are super interested in gestures, but we try to address these in a way that can be useful for this debate of the evolution of language.
Right. But I mean, cognitively speaking, there's definitely a link between gestures and language, right?
Yes. So gestures, and I was mentioning it like a bit earlier, that in other primates, we tend to just study a small subset of gestures. We know, and this is just because there is so much uncertainty about. So if we study gestures in adults, some of the things that we study in these gestures, we can just ask, and it's much easier to access to which part of the brains are activated, and lots of different details that when we, for example, we are studying other species or even human infants, you cannot just ask or be sure about certain things, about their intentions, about even if they were if they were gesturing at all or not. So the approach that like developmental psychology is used to study infants, it's basically, or we have lots of, as primatologists, we have lots of influences of some of the tools they used. So for example, to study intentionality, we use similar criteria. So I would say that we need to work, like, of course, in the same using similar methodologies, and as I mentioned before, using similar tools. But then, because it's also not possible to use exactly the same tools, we need to adapt. So it was this work that we're doing a bit before. But so what I would say, just was because we are studying a small subset, but in humans, we also gesture sometimes when we are alone, for example, as a for example, it helps us thinking about something. If you forget about something that you need to remember sometimes, or where you put your keys, or the way that you did. Sometimes we gesture and it's not for a communicative purpose. So of course, there is like this cognitive, the functions of these gestures, I would say they are a bit different, and it's hard to study in other animals. So it's why when we are talking here about gestures and these cognitive processes in gestures, I would say that if we are just talking about the comparisons of these or the evolution of gestures, we are focusing still on this subset that is more comparable. But it's super fascinating to think that, of course, the gestures also in humans have different functions, may have different functions that are not studied, or because it's so super hard to address these other functions in other animals.
Mm-hmm. So one last question then, I think. So when it comes to the cognitive and evolutionary foundations of language and the link between gestures and language, at this point in time, what do we know about it?
So about can you just repeat the?
Yes, I mean, there's as we talked about, there's a link between gestures and language. So in terms of the evolutionary and cognitive foundations of language, and through the link with gestures, what do we know about it?
So we know that most of a bit here what we mentioned a bit before. So when we studied in other primates and using similar methodologies, and if you find similar goals, similar the way they use in the flexible way, so the intentionality that I mentioned before. So all these properties are things that are studied in human language. So we can assume that they were present if they are present in this species, they would be present in these last common ancestors. So if we go back in the primate lineage a bit earlier, and if we find these same features, we can just infer that these cognitive abilities and these features of the communication were already present in these common ancestors. In humans, in language, because it's so complex, some of the features they are reported like to be maybe exclusively found in humans. But it's helpful then to understand how we would define. Is this defined in a way that it's impossible to look in the first place to other animals? So first of all, I think we need to make things, like to decompose things, and to see, okay, we have this complex ability to communicate, like using language that involves this, and it's what researchers actually do, the ones that are focusing on the evolution of communication, and then they try to look and to address these different things like functionality that I mentioned before, how they were using the gestures in this flexible way, so using the same gesture in different contexts, and these markers of intentionality, for example, that I mentioned before. So already will inform us that they had the intention to communicate this to there. So all these markers, I would say, that can tell us when they emerge in the primate lineage. And of course, as I mentioned before, they could be also, and they are present in other animals. And this can also bring us the convergent evolution scenario, or even if there are things that we are not finding, or the combination of these these features are not finding across the animal kingdom besides humans, you can say that maybe they emerge later, only in humans. So I think it's how you usually address these things in primate research or in animal communication research.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, I mean, would you like to tell us what you're going to be working on in the near future, a little bit more about your current research?
So now I'm this motherese research, the child-directed communication research. I'm focusing a bit on that part right now, trying to include other communities. So in our lab, we had like this huge archive of gestures in different apes. So we are trying to address the questions that I mentioned here before, and study these different, these finer grained features of motherese, like vocabulary complexity, temporal patterns, um, also the repetition, the prominence of our communication, if we are exaggerating the way communicating or not. So I have these features that are already addressed in these two communities of chimpanzees, and we are trying to see if they are also present in other apes, so in other chimpanzee communities, but also in bonobos and gorillas, to be able to also to make this inference, because we have like these promising results that actually they are able to adjust their communication to younger individuals, but they are not doing it the same way that we humans do. So they have probably different function, probably related with this active teaching that is not occurring in chimpanzees. So probably they will prefer to invest in the other social relationships around, and be more efficient with their own infants and immatures, because they will have time to learn. So this trend that we've seen, we are not sure if this is just because of these two communities that we studied, if it is like a general trend across the chimpanzees communities, or even if we can date back this ability of adjusting our communication to younger individuals at an early stage in evolution. So if they were present also in gorillas or in bonobos, we can date back the emergence of this ability.
Great. So, would you like to tell the audience where they can find your work on the internet?
Well, actually, I don't have any specific channel, so I think I would say Google Scholar. It's and yeah, maybe the lab webpage, but yeah, I would say Google Scholar is probably the place.
Okay. So, Daniela, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a very informative conversation.
Thank you so much, Ricardo, and it was a pleasure to be here.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht, A special thanks to my producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets and Rosie. Thank you for all.